This week we feature author of The Medium Explosion, a guide to navigating the world of those who claim to communicate with the dead. He is author of the blog series Beyond the Five Senses. He has also been featured in the trending Netflix series Surviving Death, Episode 4. He is also the founder of the Forever Family Foundation. I'd like to welcome Robert Ginsberg to the show. How you doing, Robert?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Dylan. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, no, like I was telling you earlier, thank you for, taking the time out of your busy schedule to come on the show. I really appreciate it. And I think you've got a lot of important things you can probably share with the audience. So it's kind of exciting. I think it's probably important that maybe we set the stage, if you don't mind, and maybe share a little bit of your story and kind of what has brought you to where you currently are. I know you've had an incredible journey, but perhaps even somewhat painful at times too.
Yeah, well, up until 2002, I was like a lot of people. I, was doing well in business. I was leading my materialistic life, had the big house and the toys and all that stuff, 3 children. And then, one day, on the morning of September 1st, 2002, my wife Phran shot up in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Something horrible is going to happen today." And she was trembling, she's shaking. And I said, "Well, what does that mean? What does that mean?" And she said, can't tell you exactly, but something horrible and devastating is going to happen today." So, I really was a left brain thinker, a logical thinker. I didn't really so-called, believe in any of this stuff. But there were many times during our lives together where she had these precognitive moments, and they always turned out to be true, exactly the way she told me. But they were all good things. But, logically, it told me if she was right then, she could be right now. So I did what most people would do, and most parents anyways. I watched over and checked on my 3 children throughout the day. My oldest one was about to go back to college the next day. My middle one just started, college. And my little one, Bailey, she was working a part-time job in town. And as the day progressed and the evening started to come, I kind of faded from my awareness, and I figured, okay, this was nothing. Let my guard down. We were all at dinner together, and we had 2 cars, and my oldest and my youngest took 1 car home, and we followed them, and a couple of minutes behind. And on the way home, we discovered they were in a horrible accident, and my daughter didn't survive the accident. My son had very serious injuries, and he was airlifted to another hospital. But about a month later, when it became clear to me my son was going to survive, and it was, as you can imagine, I was in a state of shock for that month. It dawned on me, wait a second, that night dawned on me, like, how did Phran know? Because she knew. I mean, it was obvious that she knew. So that started me on a search. I needed science, credible, well-credentialed scientists and researchers and medical doctors to tell me if there is evidence that we survive our physical death. Because if that was the case, I had to know, how it was possible, and if my daughter still existed somewhere. At the same time, my wife continued to have various personal experiences. She didn't necessarily need the science end of it, although she recognized it was important. And eventually, I crisscrossed the country meeting with all of these scientists and researchers. I took part in some research. I read voraciously everything that I could get my hands on. And ultimately, we decided to form this foundation. The purpose of the foundation, Forever Family Foundation, is to educate the public about evidence that we're more than our physical bodies, and at the same time support the bereaved, because after all, what could provide more hope or comfort to somebody that's in grief other than knowing that they still exist in some form? So that's it in a nutshell.
Right. Oftentimes, I think the universe, kind of gives us things that we need to experience, but perhaps not what we necessarily always want. What what are some of the, I guess, the lessons you can pull from what you've, experienced with some of the loss and some of maybe even some of the like the struggles with maybe starting up the foundation and some of the things. What are some of the lessons do you think, you've learned along the way?
Well, it's an interesting subject, because those in the spiritual community will say to you that everything that happens is for a reason. Um, I don't know that I necessarily subscribe to that. As a matter of fact, that a lot of things, when people would say that to me, especially, after my daughter passed, and now since my wife has passed, is that sometimes I bristle at the notion. It's like that. What could be the possible reason for suffering? I know recently my wife passed. I sat with her as her caregiver for 6 months as she suffered horribly from from disease. So I'm open to the possibility that that we do everything that's put before us is open. It provides some sort of a purpose. But my personal feeling is that this physical universe is random. But it's random by design, which sounds like a contradiction in terms. But I believe that we can't recognize any patterns or any lessons while we're still immersed in this physical world subject to physical laws. But after physical life, when our consciousness or our soul or our mind or whatever you want to call it, the essence of who we are, moves to another dimension, then we can see the patterns and we could see the big picture and we could see why things happen. So that's kind of my working theory on this. But I've, as you mentioned, as I go through life, I try to step back whenever I can to think of, okay, why was this put before me? Um, and sometimes it'll bring me some comfort, and sometimes it won't.
That's an interesting, I think, outlook on a take on things. And perhaps you're right. I guess we don't really know if it's random. I mean, sometimes it feels random, but let me ask you a question. If your wife was able to know that something horrible was going to happen before it happened, how do you explain the randomness in that?
Well, in my mind, when she had that experience and other experiences, I said to myself, there's only two possibilities. One, some people, like my wife, are able to um, have precognitive moments where they see future events, occurring. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that somebody was sending her a message. Basically, the way mediums work. I mean, you get a message, whether or not it's specific enough. In her case, she had the emotion. She knew something horrible was going to happen, but she couldn't pinpoint it. And that tortured me for many years, because if she was able to get more specific information, then perhaps I could have prevented the events, from occurring. So I think that we all have intuitive abilities to certain degrees. I mean, some are stronger than others. For some of us, the information comes in a very subtle fashion, and others it hits you like a ton of bricks. So um, I think it's important for us to try to embrace these intuitive moments that we have, and try to get a clearer picture. Now, sometimes that can be attained through altered states of consciousness, through meditation, dream visitations. There are different psychic exercises you could do. But I think that in today's society, we're fearful of the unknown. We fear things that the media portrays as something to be sinister. People will say, well, so I tell them stories about personal experiences, and they say, well, I have chills, and my hairs on my arms are standing on end, because they're taught maybe their religion or their cultural influences or their education or social standards teaches them to react a certain way to things that don't comply with our physical world. Anything non-physical, anything that we can't perceive or feel with our known physical senses somehow is something to be feared by the general public. And we try to tell people there's nothing to fear. It should be embraced. Quite the opposite.
So in the episode that you're featured in, there's a guy that talks about attaching meaning to a butterfly, and how this butterfly was in Times Square, and it was actually in the Marquee Theater, and he kind of thought that it was like maybe it resonated with like it being his father, or a sign that his father had still survived past the physical death. And it led me to think about my own case, and then here in a second I'm going to ask you about some of the experiences you've had with this. But so I had an experience that was similar to the butterfly that guy had with my father, and I didn't catch on right away, but I noticed like I used to have it like right after he had passed away. I had a long drive home from work, about an hour drive, and oftentimes I would see like hawks, but it would only be like when I would be thinking about my dad. So I kind of caught on to that. And then oftentimes there would be a song that would come on that maybe was his favorite song on the radio, or something that would remind me of him. And as that was happening in that moment, I would see a hawk. Well, I still brushed it off as just being me attaching meaning to this. But moving forward a few years into the future, I sit down with a psychic medium, and she's supposedly, channeling thoughts from my father. And she said something pretty peculiar to me that kind of rung a bell. She was basically, my dad was giving me lessons in life, and like how to be kind of like a simple man and just to live a simple life. But then the psychic medium says to me, she says, but he says if he had a bird's eye view, and then he said wink wink, and she didn't understand what he was talking about. But to me, like, it kind of rang true that maybe the meaning I was attaching to the hawk had something to do with that. What are some maybe signs that you've had in your lifetime?
Well, first of all, let's go with the premise that when we transition to another dimension, when our consciousness, people say, we term this thing survival of consciousness. So people say, well, what survives? I mean, your brain is dead. We think of ourselves as our brain, our bodies are in the ground. So what could possibly survive? So your energy survives, your soul, your mind, your consciousness, and it retains personalities, and that moves on. So having said that, as this entity of energy, on the other side, the theory is that people can harness that to make things occur in the physical world, such as, signs. So in your particular example, yeah, I mean, is that hawk, or is that bird, that appeared, the reincarnation of your dad? Oh, but is it possible that your dad, in trying to show you signs or evidence that he still survives, somehow imprints, into the consciousness of that bird to appear to you, and knew that you would resonate with it. And these signs, like evidently what happened with you, come with some other inner feeling, like somehow that this is not a coincidence. That it's your dad. I'll tell you one, just 2 days ago, I happened to notice, like, I came out, into the kitchen at night, and I look out my front door, and I'm not good at identifying different birds, and I live in an area where there's a ton of birds, but there was a bird sitting on the banister staring at me outside my front door. And I thought, okay, that's pretty cool. That's unusual. But she just sat there from dawn to dusk, staring at me. I actually have engaged in a staring contest with her, and she'd always win because I couldn't stand there all day, and she could. So I decided, okay, well, if I open up the screen door, she's going to immediately, fly away. And my screen door sort of sticks and it makes a noise. And I opened it up and she just stays there. and I can approach her like right in front of her, and she just will not move. She just, goes, and she'll go away periodically and she comes back. So I happen to send that to, I had posted it on Facebook because I thought maybe somebody knew like what kind of bird it was. It turns out it's a mourning dove, mourning in the sense like a mourning, and then I get all these explanations that it comes from people. The theory is that it comes to provide, comfort to those that bereaved. So can you choose to write it off as coincidence? Sure, I could, because look, I live in an area where there's a lot of birds. I've never seen a bird like that, and I never had one that, but it came with that kind of inner feeling, like, as with you, that okay, this may be my wife that's, letting me know, So there are these signs that happen, and sometimes it's a movement of objects, things aren't where you left them. Sometimes it's common as flickering lights. I think if you watched the Netflix series, you saw I gave them a clip that my wife filmed in our kitchen, where for no apparent reason we were thinking of my daughter, and we had a series of 9 hi-hats in the kitchen, and in one row it just started, it was like a light show, and it went on for like 20 minutes. It didn't stop. Now, of course, with my usual open-minded skeptic, as an open-minded skeptic, I immediately got an electrician there the next morning. I had made him take apart the switches. And of course, there was nothing wrong with the switch. There was nothing wrong with the bulbs. It never happened before. It never happened after that. So that to me was something significant, because I couldn't explain it in physical terms, and so it manipulated, energy. Sometimes I mentioned in the most common form of after-death communication comes in the form of dream visitations. The theory being, when you're in this REM stage of sleep, when your conscious mind is set aside, all that chatter, that those who are energy in the spirit realm can see a conduit in which they can get through to you, and people wake up and they have these really tactile dreams where they could see their loved one and touch them and hug them and talk to them and so forth. And it's totally different than a fragmented, so-called regular dream. So these are things that happen all the time. Being involved in this work, I think that, it's been written about for 100 years, people are having all these experiences, and it's considered anecdotal evidence. It can't be studied in a laboratory, but the scope of it, just the sheer number of these experiences that people have, makes it kind of hard to dismiss.
Yeah, it does. And what are your thoughts on mediums?
All right, well, I go into this extensively in my book, The Medium Explosion. I mean, it comes out of, we've been at the foundation, we started a medium certification program in 2005. And I've, over the years, some scientists to help me develop the program, which we conduct under controlled conditions. And my experience is that 85 to 90% of all the medium practitioners out there can't do what they claim. Bothers me, because mediums have a real responsibility. They're sitting with very fragile people who are hanging on by a thread. And the thought that they may be taken advantage of drives me crazy. So that led me, into writing this book. It doesn't dismiss mediumship. It's quite the contrary. I show that there are 10 to 15% of the people that are extraordinary, and they can truly make a difference in somebody's life, and they get information that they could not have possibly known. And I get into the specific arguments on, for and against, are they reading my mind, and I get into cold reading techniques and and my opinion is that only a small percentage of them are fraudulent. I mean, they do exist, and there are plenty of them. Most of them just have some degree of intuitive ability, like you and I do. And then they see some famous medium on TV, and they say, oh, I want to be like so-and-so. And some family member or maybe another medium says, hey, you have intuitive ability. And there's no governing body, there's no ethical standards, there's no licensing board. So the next day you hang up a shingle and say, I'm a medium, you start charging a lot of money to people. Sometimes you give them really general messages that would apply to 90% of the people. And I point out that I could give you a reading right now that's 90% accurate, but it's all general bullshit.
Right, right.
So I teach ways in which you can identify the specific evidence versus the general stuff. And
Now,
so
this certification program, is this something that's kind of like trying to be like a board, or a way to kind of?
well, I recommend that we actually have developed these things, but we have no authority other than attesting to the fact that during our procedure, that they exhibited a real high level of proficiency in this, spirit communication. Is it possible that a really good medium would fail? Yeah. Don't forget that mediums aren't used to being put in the position of being tested, in a clinical atmosphere. And there are electronic issues and so forth. So we can only attest to the fact that they scored really well in our procedure. However, saying that, we found that over many years, most of the mediums that we've certified, which is basically 10% of them, have gone on to very long careers. They've participated in mediumship research, and they've become very famous, which has kind of worked against the purpose of the program, because a great number of these mediums have gone on to fame and fortune and have TV shows. And what happens then is that they either stop doing readings, or they have a 3-4 year long waiting list, or they charge really extraordinary amounts of money for readings. And we developed this to be purely as a resource for the bereaved. So if you're hurting and you're grieving and you call and you want a reading and you're told you put on a 3-year waiting list, doesn't do much good, So the answer for us is to go out and identify more of these practitioners upon whom you can rely, and that's what we're working on now. We're evaluating more, and we want to have more people on the list.
I love that idea. That's pretty cool. There's a guy by the name of Bob Olson. Are you familiar with him at all?
Yeah, what we do, is a bit different. And no medium can pay to participate in the program, and
Right.
no medium can pay to be listed on our site. And we do conduct a certification where they're doing 5 different readings, under controlled conditions. So, we may be a bit more restrictive and comprehensive than some of the programs that are out there today.
I do like that, though. I mean, it sounds pretty cool. And I know, at least from my experience, and I don't know, what the parameters are that he kind of, the guidelines that he has with these psychic mediums before they go on his list, but I feel like the one that I used was pretty legitimate. I used it from his list. But
Yeah.
I like what you're doing. I think it's very important work that, you lead people in the right direction with people that can give them, real, genuine information.
Yeah. And bear in mind, a lot of the, when we score the information, we weight a piece of specific evidence more heavily in the scoring than a general piece of information. So, if you're the medium, Dylan, and you're giving me a reading, and I'm sitting with you, and you could size me up about how old I am, and you say to me, I'm sensing you have a grandmother in spirit. Do you have a grandmother in spirit? Well, I have to mark that true because I have a grandmother in spirit, but considering the fact that she'd be 120 years old, how many people 120 years old are living today? So, but if you said to me, hey, Bob, your grandmother Julia is here, and my grandmother's name was Julia, I would have to score that more heavily than that general piece of information.
So it's obvious that you put some pretty good amount of importance to mediums. What,
Yeah.
can you maybe, how important is it?
Well, mediums are one form of evidence, that we survive our physical death. one of many. I mean, just as important is the research with near-death experiences. With near-death experiences where people meet every definition of death. They have no heartbeat, they have no respiration, they have no brain waves, they have no reflexes. For all, as in medical terms, they're dead. And yet, with all our resuscitative techniques today, many people are brought, back to life, and they describe things that they could not have known, with a dead brain and being dead. So a lot of them describe separating from their bodies, which in theory would be their consciousness that is freed of the physical body, being at a different vantage point, seeing everything that went on in the room. Sometimes being outside the room at another location. They describe, a lot of them will describe meeting deceased loved ones that have passed before them. And a lot of this veridical information that can later be verified, that wouldn't necessarily know. A lot of famous cases. And that is, I think, the first episode of the Netflix documentary Surviving Death addresses near-death experiences. Then there are end-of-life experiences like deathbed visions, where people near death have these visitations from deceased relatives. Most times, the people in the room, the physical room, can't see them, but the patient can, and it gives them great comfort. And the implication is that we all have help when we cross over. There are a lot of medical doctors today that run hospices, and they and the people that work for them are very well aware of this. As a matter of fact, they know when somebody's going to pass, because they start seeing, and I've experienced that with my own family. So, I know it to be true. Then there's evidence for past life memories of children, which is also featured in that documentary, where reincarnation, where children remember these past lives, and the investigators go out and they gather, medical reports and autopsy reports, and they go to visit the families that the child remembers being part of, and then they know all of the people there, and they know all of the habits and all of the routines and so forth. So the evidence is very, very compelling. Then you have these after-death communications, which we talked a little bit about, all these signs, that people get. There's electronic voice phenomena, which most people won't know, but the theory is that if you take let's say a tape recorder, but now there's no more tape, all the recorders are digital or on your phone, and you just simply set an intention that you want to, talk to somebody in specific that's no longer with us in the physical. You turn on the recorder for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, you shut it off. Sometimes there are recordings of voices that appear with no physical, explanation for it. It doesn't happen all the time. As a matter of fact, some people experiment with it for months or years before they start getting recordings. But I have a friend who also happens to be a medium, but she experiments and has been experimenting with electronic voice phenomena for about 10 years or more. And she, after my wife's passing, she started setting up weekly sessions where she would ask my wife 7 or 8 specific questions, waiting for answers. And some of them have been pretty amazing. And one of them, she said, she asked my wife, "What is the name of the organization that you founded?" And you hear faintly but very clearly, Forever Family Foundation.
Wow.
So, stuff like that is really, I mean, if you can eliminate the possibility of fraud, that somehow the medium is in cahoots and somebody else is in the room making the recording, and I know that's not the case, it's pretty interesting, and there are a lot of other very, very specific ones in EVP, and she sends me these recordings, and I listen to them. So all of these things, mediumship is really important, and mediumship, as I mentioned earlier, it has the potential to transform, one's grief. But if you don't have a broad knowledge of all these other forms of evidence, what happens sometimes, you get a very strong medium reading and you're kind of on a high for a week or two. And then you go back leading your regular life and listening to other people and you say, maybe I'm imagining this, but if you have this broader foundation upon which you can rely from your own research and your own reading and watching your own, videos, then you could say, wait a second, all these things can't be wrong. I can't dismiss all of it, So that's why it's important. We always recommend that people, we don't want them to become psychic junkies and just follow mediums and not learn about everything else. We can be our own personal communicators without hanging up a shingle and being a medium.
Absolutely. Well said. Your belief in the physical world, I mean, is it just an illusion, or what are we doing here?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because a lot of people have contemplated that over the years, like kind of what's the meaning of life and what's the meaning of the physical world. Um, the I've heard a lot of explanations, some from channeled reports, that channeled writings of people that communicated through physical mediums, not so much today, but in the past, and also with near-death experiences come back and tell us, and that they say that there are certain things that you cannot learn in these other realms. You can only learn in this physical world. I mean, it's a hard concept. Somebody once described it as, it's the only place where you can get this physical rush. You can't get this rush, when you're in an entity of pure spirit that doesn't feel pain and doesn't have any, you don't have any physical ailments and you don't have any emotional trauma. You're kind of a clear channel there, but you need the juxtaposition of the physical world, to have something to relate it to. So I don't know, what the real meaning and purpose. I say to myself often, well, why do we need this torture? Why do we need this sadness? Why do we have to look around us and see what's going on? If we're in this, if we eventually go to this world where that doesn't exist, can't we grow there? Why do we have to grow here? So I contemplate that question a lot. There seems to be, based upon what everybody says, a real purpose to it. But we have to bear in mind that this physical realm is just a little tiny blip in this broad continuum of existence. So those that are on the other side, they're not grieving. We're the ones, that are grieving. They're not
Right.
grieving because they know they still exist.
That's right.
But then the question is, well, do they feel our pain? Do they feel our emotions? Do they feel our sadness? Sometimes I use that as a coping mechanism, saying, hey, if this affects them and adversely, and they feel our pain, why I don't want them to feel my pain,
Right.
So it gives you some sort of momentum to continue on with your life.
Yeah, I do think that that's a possibility, right? That maybe we are here to experience pain. Like you said, you can't really feel that maybe on the other side. Perhaps loss as well, because I mean, if we are a conscious energy that continues to live forever, I mean, you're not really going to experience loss perhaps in other places like you would here on Earth.
True.
Because even like time itself is probably not really like time here on Earth. I wouldn't think.
Yeah, and that is the theory that, there are no physical laws where they are, and there's no time and space. So things that do not work in a linear fashion like we have here, past, present, and future. Um, Everything is all, as one.
Where do you believe our consciousness does go when we die? I mean, obviously you believe it exists beyond the physical, but where do you think we go? What do you think we're
Yeah,
doing?
well, I don't know whether that we go to any, we think in physical terms, so we have to go to a specific place, but maybe it just is, so, and it is across all dimensions, at once. Now, there are many people who believe, also because of these spiritual writings and channel reports and near-death experiences, that there are different realms of existence. So we may go to a place that we're among people that think the way that we think, and that brings into other questions. Well, where do bad people go? Where does Hitler go? Are we going to this, all going to the same place? And the consensus seems to be that there's no deity or entity or religious icon or a panel of judges that sits there and evaluates, okay, you go here and you go there and you go here. It's all self-judgment. And near-death experiences describe life reviews, where it's like a movie reel in fast, just like in blips, where a whole life is put before us. And we feel the pain that we cause to others. We also feel the joy and the happiness that that people feel as a result of our actions. We judge ourselves, and maybe that determines which level, so to speak, we move into. So I think that we have a different perspective when we're dead. How could we not? So people that were evil and did terrible things in the physical world eventually, I think, have some sort of growth on the other side and see things a bit differently, and they take them longer to get where others may go or already be, but I think eventually, everybody will get there. So I don't think it's a specific place that we go, but who knows?
And I often wondered this question of what's the end game, or what's the purpose? Is it just to keep learning lessons and to grow? But I mean, are we going to continually, do this eternally? I mean, is this just like a playground for us to come have experiences and then leave? Or is there some other greater purpose that, us as conscious energy we need to grow and become something different?
Yeah, well, that's where the concept of reincarnation comes in. So you decide that you didn't grow enough in the physical realm, and you need to learn more lessons, so to speak. So you decide to come back and do it again. I always had a hard time with that concept, because why would I choose to come back in a life of despair and poverty and starvation or disease or war, and why would I choose that life? And in physical terms makes no sense, but in spiritual terms, maybe our souls are it's like an oversoul. It's a combination of all of our parts and all of our lives, and there are little bits and pieces that have to be filled in. And we're not worried about this physical trauma that we feel, or mental trauma here, because we know that it is that little just short thing in time, so that people fulfill themselves. But yet the evidence seems to show that not everybody has to come back. It's a choice. So what the end game is, maybe the end game is just coming to a realization that the physical world and the spirit world are all part of the same thing, and that we can move freely back and forth. And we do. Our ancestors in ancient times seem to know this. They communed with their ancestors on a regular basis. There are tribes that still do communicate telepathically. We get each other. It's all based on mind and not on physicality. And maybe I think our ancestors did know that. We lived in ages of mysticism that spanned, tens of thousands of years. I mean, you can make the argument that all of the founders of today's organized religions came out of the age of mysticism, before all the rules and before all the dogma. It just was, and they just knew. That got changed throughout time. And maybe all of these intuitive senses that we had, which were once part of us as our sight and hearing is today, those physical senses got weaned out of us, and maybe ultimately our purpose in the physical world is to bring them back in. People talk about these paradigm shifts, and maybe that's what's happening today. More and more people, it seems, are searching for meaning and purpose because nothing seems to make sense.
Good explanation. In one of your blogs, you talked about being remembered and how most will be forgotten after a few generations. And why is this important to you? I mean, you even mentioned that it may even be frightening for some people that, they will be forgotten throughout time. At least the majority of people will, unless there's someone famous.
I think that people, after losing a loved one, I know I did. My biggest fear after my daughter passed was that she's going to be forgotten. I wanted to keep her alive, so to speak. I wanted to keep the knowledge of her and who she was, alive with her friends and with her teachers and so forth. So I think that's kind of normal. We have a fear of death because death is so final. We live in an age where almost anything is possible, except, after my daughter passed, I was in a situation, there was nothing that I could do. There was absolutely nothing that I could do to change it. I was helpless. So I think that we all want our loved ones to be remembered. But the reality is, why I wrote that blog, is that if you think about it, we're remembered for, 2 or 3 generations, and that's it. I don't know anything about my great grandparents or their parents and who they were and what they stood for, and so forth. So is that important? It's only important for us in physical terms. It's not important to where they are, because they do still exist. And their memories and who they are is still, very much alive. So, I wrote that more as people should put in perspective why they really fear, being extinguished, because if you believe that you're not extinguished, not being remembered becomes moot.
Yeah, very good. The Forever Family Foundation, it's doing very healing work. And I think I had mentioned to you off air that it was probably a foundation that I could have probably used about 5, 6 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about, kind of some of the things that you guys do, maybe some of the retreats and stuff like that?
Yeah, we started off by simply having what we called afterlife discussion groups. I know that my wife and I would go to an organization that was made up of bereaved parents, and that to deal, that we're dealing with grief. And every time that either my wife Phran or I would bring up the subject of an afterlife, the moderator of the group would shut us down. Oh, no, 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 we don't talk about such things here. We only talk about ways that you could deal with your grief. And we thought that was odd because everybody in the room wanted to talk about it because that was the only thing that would give them any hope. So we used to stand outside in the parking lot, in the winter, freezing our asses off, and talking with each other about this stuff. So we figured there needed to be an organization where people can have these open discussions about what happens after physical death without fear of being judged or labeled, And then, so we started off this organization with having these groups in different parts of the country. Then we moved into our work with mediums, in the certification program. And then we started working with scientists and researchers from major universities that studied all these things. We don't conduct research on our own, but we want to highlight and teach people about the established evidence, that's out there. And then we'd hold major conferences in various major cities in the United States where we bring all these people together. And then then we started a magazine called Signs of Life magazine, which we've just now, after Phran's passing, we stopped publishing because it was just too much and too expensive to print and send and put together a physical magazine. But the past issues are available, on our website. And we've been doing a radio show, and we still do it. We've been doing it since 2005. We interview all the people in the field. We devote one show. We have 5 different formats. One format is mediums and messages, where people can call in and get free mini readings from one of our certified mediums. And we have those discussion group conversations on the radio. So that's every Thursday, and people can look on our website for familyfoundation.org, and they could, tune into the radio show. And every radio show since 2005 is archived. So you can, if you read a book or you hear about somebody, type in the name. Chances are, over the past 15 years, we've interviewed them, and you could hear an interview on them. And then we have, recommended books, by category that people could use as a resource. We do webinar series. Matter of fact, I'm doing a webinar on mediumship myself on March 17th that people could join in. And of course, these grief retreats, that were featured in the thing. These retreats, Dylan, I could tell you, we limit each retreat to only 50 people because we want it to be an intimate experience. And we have seen over the years, it's amazing, people that walk in on Friday afternoon, and they're in such a stage of horrible grief that they can't smile, they could barely talk, and you could just, feel their pain. And then when we say goodbye Sunday night, there's smiling and there's some laughter, and you could see a different, the hope in their eyes. And that you can't put a price on, and we just hope that it stays with them. We try to reinforce it. So we call them grief transformation retreats because we don't want to suggest that it's a magic pill. I mean, you can't cure grief. You're always going to have that hole in your heart. But if you can walk away with the knowledge that they still exist, you can dig yourself out of those deep chasms of despair and reflect upon what you witnessed and what you experienced and what you learned, and live a life with meaning and purpose again. And that's what we see.
That's beautifully said. The journey that you're on, I mean, is it completely driven by grief? I mean, an unexplained phenomenon, or is it a combination of things? What has driven you? Yeah, because I mean, you're a passionate guy about what you're doing and what you're teaching. I mean, is it what is it that drives you, I guess?
Yeah, I guess, after my daughter's passing, my wife more so than me, I mean, this became her only driving force in life. I mean, she'd work literally 18 hours each day, 7 days a week, never took we never would take a vacation. I'd have to plead with her to take a short break, take a walk or something, so she believed that this was her purpose in life. This is what all her life was about. And I still, to this, it's been 6 months, and I still get emails every day from people all over the world saying, I don't know if you know this, but when I was in this horrible deep grief after my loved one died, I called your office, and your wife picked up the phone, and she talked to me for 2.5 hours. With all the, she didn't have any time for anything. But if somebody called that was in grief, and she did this, I don't know where she found the time, but she did this constantly. So, on the other hand, I tell people I wasn't a co-founder of this foundation with the sole purpose of helping others. I was in it for my own exploration, just to find meaning in my own life. Because I wasn't fully sold on this for 7 years after we started the foundation. That changed, and after I became, I say that people go from this vague hope to this belief, and ultimately, if they're lucky, to this inner knowing. So it wasn't until I reached this inner knowing stage, then in my life, my purpose became Phran's purpose. So now, I do it. When you're stripped down to nothing, when material things mean absolutely nothing to you anymore, you reevaluate everything. And I found that the only thing that gave me any real meaning or purpose or happiness was making a difference in somebody else's life. Now, bear in mind, as I say this, I remember my prior life, and I'd say, nah, that's all a bunch of crap. I used to hear people, and I used to say things like that and say, yeah. But it's true. I lived it, and that is the only thing. I was searching for anything that would give me any kind of happiness. That has and still does. So now that is especially now that I'm doing this alone, that's my only thing that keeps me going, So, and it helps me to keep busy and do all these things. So, I would say that is now my life's purpose, that, and doing some writing and family.
Well, it's great work that, your wife and you have been doing and have done. You know, it's things like that I think, the world needs for sure. Like you said, it gives people hope, and grief is, if you lose somebody close to you, it's very challenging to keep pushing and to get through life's other obstacles when that's kind of a roadblock or kind of a, I don't know, just something you're struggling with. But it's been a great discussion. Thanks for coming on the show. Where can we get a hold of your book? Where can we find your foundation, your radio show? Let
All
us
right.
know where
Well,
we can get a hold of you.
yeah, it's foreverfamilyfoundation.org. All spelled out, Forever Family Foundation. There's a link to my book. The book can be purchased on Amazon. It's called The Medium Explosion. People can get my blog on beyondthefivesenses.com. And the radio show and everything else that we do can be accessed via our website. And if anybody needs to or wants to send me an email, I'm always accessible at robert@foreverfamilyfoundation.org.
Thanks again for coming on the show, and thanks for
Thank
sharing.
you. Enjoyed it, Dylan. Thank you very much.